Alrighty, evidence for global warming. By the end of this section, be able to explain how carbon dioxide concentrations have changed over the past 6 decades and how we compare emissions amongst nations of the entire world, and explain how temperatures have increased since 1880. Also, we're going to discuss how we estimate temperatures and levels of greenhouse gases for over the past 500,000 years, and explain the role of feedbacks, particularly feedback loops, on the impacts of climate change. Now that we have reviewed greenhouse gases and their role in global warming, we can explore the evidence that an increase in concentration of greenhouse gases is causing the Earth to become warmer. In 1988, the United Nations and the World Meteorological Organization, they created this intergovernmental panel, and it was on climate change. It was called IPCC. It's a group of more than 3,000 scientists from all over the world, and they work together to assess climate change. Their mission is to really understand the details of the global warming system, the effects of climate change on biodiversity, and energy fluxes in the ecosystems, and the economic and social effects of climate change. IPCC enables scientists to assess and communicate the state of our knowledge and to suggest research directions that would improve our understanding in the future. So this is a collaborative effort that's produced an excellent understanding of how greenhouse gases and temperatures are linked. Although the work that the IPCC now understands that CO2 is an important greenhouse gas and that it can contribute to global warming. But we didn't always realize this. In fact, the first half of the 20th century, most scientists believed that if any excess CO2 was being produced and pumped into the atmosphere, it'd be absorbed by oceans and trees and plants, basically vegetation. In addition to that, because the concentration of atmospheric CO2 was really low compared to gases like oxygen and nitrogen, it was really difficult to measure this accurately. The first scientist to overcome this was Charles David Keeling. He basically overcame the technical difficulties in measuring carbon dioxide. When he set out to measure the precise level of CO2 in the atmosphere, most atmospheric scientists believed that the two measures several years apart would be sufficient enough to answer the question of whether or not humans were causing all of this increased concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. But Keeling knew better. He did not agree with any of this, and in 1958 he began collecting data throughout the year over an observatory in Hawaii. After about a year of his work, he found that CO2 levels varied seasonally, and of course their concentrations increased from year to year. His results prompted him to take measurements for several more years, and he eventually had students work with him. So here's a graph that shows Keeling's early findings. And although CO2 concentrations, they vary between seasons, it is clear that the trend overall is rising. And carbon dioxide concentration, we see an increase throughout the years. This increase over time is really correlated to human emissions of carbon. And that's probably from fossil fuel combustion and the net overall destruction of the vegetation across our planet. We have a math problem that we will do that will show you how CO2 increases in the future, give you the opportunity to understand it better. But what causes these variations? If you look at the graph, there are tiny little fluctuations throughout an average year. And if you think about it, at the same time, bodies of water, they begin to warm, and so algae and plants, they also begin to photosynthesize more. And in doing this, these producers, they take up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And opposite of that, when it becomes fall, the leaves, they drop to the ground, crops are harvested, bodies of water get colder, so things can't grow as quickly in them. And so the uptake of atmospheric carbon dioxide by all of this vegetation, it declines. And so we do see fluctuations throughout an actual year. But throughout this entire semester, we have seen that the per capita consumption of fossil fuels and materials is greatest in the developed world. And so it's not surprising that the production of carbon dioxide has also been the greatest in the developed world. For many decades, the 20% of the population living in the developed world, it's about a billion people, we've produced about 75% of all the carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere. These percentages are changing as some developing nations are starting to industrialize and acquire more vehicles and burning more fossil fuels. In fact, in 2009, developing countries surpassed developed countries in the production of carbon dioxide. But development has been especially rapid in China and India, which together contain 1/3 of the world's population. So from 2000 to 2009, China more than doubled its emission of carbon dioxide as the country built many new coal-fired power plants. And so this increased its ability to burn coal. Here we can see in this figure, which shows China today as being the leading emitter of carbon dioxide. China emits more than 7,200 million metric tons of carbon dioxide, and that represents about 24% of the global contribution. The United States is in second place, so we're not off the hook here, and we're emitting more than 5,300 million metric tons, and this represents about 18% of the CO2. Yet, really, the United States, though, only contains about 5% of the world's population. So if you consider the amount per capita of CO2 emissions, we can see a very different picture here as far as who's really leading the CO2 production. The United States and Australia are leading per capita emitters. And I think if you look here at the picture, you can see that that's followed by Saudi Arabia and then Canada. Despite the fact that China and India rank amongst the top producers, their per capita production ranks them like 16th, 20th, respectively. And so we can see that that basically reflects the large population of those countries. All right, so before we can determine if global temperature increasing is a recent phenomenon, then we need to look at the increase to see if it's actually unusual. We must establish how temperatures of Earth have changed in the past. And since about 1880, there's been enough of these direct measurements on land and ocean temperatures that have been produced and studied. A lot of it's been done in space studies. So this graph, which is usually updated monthly, shows this temperature over time. And if you look at it, it's comprised of thousands of measurements that are taken from all over the world, and it's showing you here a global temperature. You can see the increases. So from 1880 to 2013, we've had the 10 warmest years on record here between 1998 and 2013. So while an increase in average global temperature overall has gone up 0.8 degrees Celsius, that's 1.4 degrees Fahrenheit, it may not sound very substantial, but it's not evenly distributed around the planet. Here we're about to see a map that shows some regions, including parts of Antarctica, that are experiencing cooler temperatures, and some regions, including like the oceans, which are experiencing no temperature change at all. And then there's those in some extreme that are experiencing an extreme high increase. Since there was no way to measure temperatures thousands of years ago, we must use some sort of indirect measurement. And a common indirect measurement includes species composition and organisms that have been preserved for millions of years. And we basically analyze air bubbles that have been formed in ice a long time ago. So one common use in a biological measurement is the composition of a small group of protists. And they have a specialized name. These small protists, they're called foraminifers. And so Foraminifera, which is the phylum name, they're these tiny little marine organisms, and they have hard shells, and so that helps them resist decay when they die. In some regions of the ocean floor, these tiny shells have been building up in sediments over the millions of years. And the youngest sediment layers are near the top of the ocean floor, where the oldest sediment layers are much deeper. So fortunately for us, different species of these foraminifers, they prefer different types of water temperatures. And so as a result, scientists identify the predominant species in a particular layer of sediment, and then they can infer the likely temperature of the ocean at that time, that of when that layer of sediment was deposited. So by examining thousands of sediment layers and samples, we can kind of gain an insight into temperature change over millions of years. So this image is from 2010, and you can see that some regions are becoming cooler while some regions they had no temperature change at all, and then there's the northern latitudes which are becoming substantially warmer than their overall average temperature. So the surface temperatures that are plotted on this map, they represent difference in their relative overall average temperatures between 1951 to 1980 based on the PROTUS data. Not only using these foraminifers, but scientists can also determine the change in greenhouse gas concentrations and temperatures over long periods of time by examining ancient ice. In cold areas like Antarctica, which is at the top of the Himalayas, there is snowfall each year, and eventually that snow compresses and it becomes ice. Similar to the way marine sediment works. So the youngest ice is near the surface and the oldest ice is much deeper. During the process of compression, the ice captures small, tiny air bubbles, and these air bubbles contain tiny little samples of the atmosphere that existed when that ice formed and when it fell. So scientists have traveled to these frozen regions for quite some time, and here they drill deep into the ice and they extract these long tubes of ice, of which they call ice cores. Samples of these ice cores, they can span up to 500,000 years of ice formation, and scientists can determine the age of the different layers of the ice core and then melt the ice from a piece associated with that particular time period. And when that piece of ice melts, the air bubbles are released, and the scientists can measure the concentration of greenhouse gases in that air bubble when it was trapped, in that ancient ice. Oxygen atoms in melted ice can also be used to determine temperatures from the distant past. Oxygen atoms occur in two forms, or isotopes actually. Light oxygen and what we call oxygen 16, which contains 8 protons and 8 neutrons, and also oxygen 18, which we call heavy oxygen, that has 8 protons plus 10 neutrons. So ice formed during a period of warmer temperatures contains a higher percentage of heavy oxygen than ice forms during colder temperatures. And so by examining the changes and the percentages of heavy oxygen atoms from different layers of the ice core, we can basically indirectly estimate temperatures from hundreds of thousands of years ago. And when we combine this data from different biological and physical measurements, researchers, they've created this picture of how the atmosphere and Earth has changed over hundreds of thousands of years. And so this diagram or graph shows the pattern of CO2 that what scientists have put together over the past 400,000 years. So if you look at this graph, you can notice that over the last 400,000 years, the atmosphere never contained more than 300 ppm parts per million of carbon dioxide. In addition, from 1958 to 2013, the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere has rapidly climbed from 310 to 400 ppm. And so this means that the rise of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere during the past 50 years has been unprecedented itself. And if during the past 10,000 years, carbon dioxide is not only greenhouse gas whose concentration has increased, but it's also increased methane and nitrous oxide.